The galaxy's elite hunters poisoned the Deathworld girl. They realized too late what Earth had sent. The readout had been on my screen for 11 minutes. I had not moved, not because I was confused. I have worked in toxicological certification for 29 years. I know what Velkarath looks like inside a body. I know the shape of it the way I know the shape of my own hands, the uptake curve, the cascade sequence, the point where the markers flatten because there is nothing left to measure. I know all of it. What I did not know was why 1.7 milliliters of cumulative Velkarath was sitting in a cadet's bloodwork doing nothing at all. Present, measurable, inert, as if it had walked into a room, looked around, and sat down. My skin was not silver. I checked without meaning to, a reflex, the kind that takes over when the professional part of you is busy trying to find an explanation. Silver means calm. Silver means certainty. What I had on my arms in that moment was closer to pale blue, which in Ketharan physiology means the body is running something it does not have a name for yet. I straightened in my chair and looked at the screen again. The readout had not changed. I pulled up the trial footage, 2:11. I had already watched it 4 times. A small dented tin sat on the bench beside a girl named Sen Orvath. Brown hair, borrowed collar clip, 17 years old, 49 kilograms. She had come in from the corridor at 1:51 and sat down without pressing her back against anything, which is not unusual but which I had noticed. The tin was in her left hand. She set it on the bench like it was a habit. I had not logged the tin. I should have logged it. I watched the footage again. The tin had a half-peeled label. The seams were worn at the edges in the way that means it has been opened and closed many times by hands that know it well. It did not match any listed equipment. It did not match any permitted personal items in the trial intake protocol. I had looked at it at 1:51, decided it was within parameters, and moved on. My skin was full violet by the time I made myself stop watching. Rewind to 1:49, 6 hours earlier. The cohort was being assembled in the observation corridor outside Trial Chamber 7. Drevath Station runs Class 8 exposure sequences on the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of each month, when the atmospheric cycling is cleanest. 8 births, 1 compound. The goal is not to harm. It is to certify physiological response data for multi-species deployment records. Every species that enters the chamber leaves with a file. The file either confirms what we already know or adds a single new line to the literature. In 29 years, I had added maybe 40 new lines. Chamber 7 had blue-cold pre-dawn lighting because the atmospheric cycle had not turned over yet. The kind of light that makes everything look like it is waiting for something. I stood at the observation window and watched 7 cadets fill the berths in the order they had been assigned. 3 Vorthrak in berths 1, 2, and 3. Broad-plated, heavy, built for high-gravity systems. Vorthrak have synaptic relay clusters along their dorsal line that lock up under Velkarath exposure. The plates stiffen and go quiet, which in a species that communicates largely through resonance means something closer to temporary paralysis than anything else. They know it. They train for it. One of the 3 was always a soldier. You can tell by how they pick a berth with a sightline to the door. 2 Orvath in berths 4 and 5. Open circulatory systems, which means Velkarath moves through them fast and they feel it fast. Orvath cluster when stressed, press toward each other, and then their systems overload and they go down. Not dangerous at monitored doses. Expected. Standard. 1 human in berth 6. 49 kilograms. 17 contradictory papers in the human literature, 4 of which directly contradicted the other 13 on metabolic absorption rate. No confirmed baseline. No controlled exposure sequence on record. We had estimated the human LD50 from cross-referencing primate data and 3 partial volunteer trials that had been discontinued before reaching useful concentrations. Our best number was 1.3 milliliters per kilogram cumulative. The trial was designed to run 4 vials at escalating concentrations for a total delivery of 1.7 milliliters per kilogram. 0.4 past the estimated lethal dose. We had medical support staged. We had the intervention protocol loaded. We had 17 papers, 4 of which contradicted each other, and we had never run a human through a full Class 8 sequence. Sen Orvath sat in berth 6 and opened the dented tin. She did it quietly without looking around to see if anyone was watching. Reached in, took something small and pale out, put it on the bench beside her. Then closed the tin and held it in her lap the way someone holds something familiar. Her heart rate on my monitor was 61 beats per minute. She did not appear to be preparing for anything. I have since learned the pale things were citrus candies. Small ones, wrapped in a twist of thin paper. Her intake file listed no dietary supplements, no compounds, no permitted personal comfort items. The tin had not been through materials screening. I had not logged it. I should have logged it. At 2:03, I ran the pre-trial baseline check. 7 cadets, 7 readouts, all within expected parameters. Sen's heart rate was 61. Her respiratory pattern was slow and even, which I noted as possibly deliberate. Some cadets breathed down before a hard sequence. Her metabolic indicators showed nothing unusual. She had one hand resting on the tin and was looking at the far wall with the expression of someone waiting for a bus. At 2:07, I delivered the standard pre-trial briefing over the intercom. Sen did not look up. The vials release on a locked timer, 2:14. Vial 1 is 0.3 milliliters per kilogram, the lightest in the sequence, designed to prime the cascade response before the second vial deepens it. Every species in that room had a documented first response profile. I know what to watch for and in what order. The Vorthrak plates locked at 2:14, 31 seconds after release. I heard it through the chamber wall, 94 decibels, the dry crack of armored tissue locking simultaneously across 3 bodies. Berths 1, 2, 3 went rigid. Standard, on schedule. The Orvith in berths 4 and 5 pressed together at 2:15. They do not make noise. They simply move until they are touching, and then their systems catch up to the compound and they go down together, slow and even like something settling. Standard. Expected. I was watching the Vorthrak because the soldier one had a habit of testing his plate lock range instead of holding still, which causes equipment flags I then have to note in the record. I was watching him when Sen reached into the tin. She placed a citrus candy on her tongue at 2:15, 1 second after the Orvith began to cluster. I did not see it happen. I was watching berth 1. By 2:28, I had a CO2 reading in the chamber of 1,400 parts per million. Sen's heart rate had dropped from 61 to 53. Her respiratory rate had not increased. The cascade markers, the set of 7 indicators that show how a body is processing Velcarath, were running the same pattern I had seen 14 minutes earlier, which meant they had not moved. I have 4,400 certified trial files. I have seen cascade markers move in 6 seconds on a Vorthrak. I have seen them move in 3 on an Orvith with compromised plating. I have seen them on species I had never encountered before, and still the shape of it was recognizable. The spike, the drop, the plateau, the long tail of metabolic clearance. Sen's cascade markers were flat. I stared at the readout for 3 seconds before I accepted that it said what it said. At 2:31, I ran the check again, 7 indicators, all flat. Velcarath was present in her bloodstream. I could measure the compound, see the concentration rising as the chamber exposure continued. It was there. It was simply doing nothing. I looked through the observation glass at the junior technician running the instrument panel on the chamber side. She was looking at her screen. Then she looked at me. I gave her nothing. Sen looked at the environmental display on the chamber wall at 2:33. The CO2 reading was still 1,400 parts per million, elevated, which happens when the Vorthrak lock response reduces their respiration. She looked at it for a moment, then looked up at the ceiling vent. She said, "Is the scrubber broken? It's a little stuffy." Her voice had no urgency. She asked it the way you would ask someone in a corridor whether the lift was out of service. Matter of fact, a small inconvenience she had noticed and was mentioning in case it was relevant. The Orvith were already down. The Vorthrak were locked and silent. The junior technician did not move. I wrote 3 words in my notation file and deleted them. They were not a technical term. What I had was a compound present at measurable concentrations, in a subject whose body was responding to it the way a body responds to something that is not there. Not suppressed, not masked, flat in the way it would be if the compound were simply not present, except it was present. I ran the cascade indicators again. Flat. Vial 2 released at 2:41. Concentration now 1.1 milliliters per kilogram. The surviving Vorthrak, the one who was not the soldier and had not locked as hard on Vial 1, went quiet, not the plate lock quiet of Vial 1. A different quiet. Vorthrak communicate through resonance, low-frequency sound you feel more than hear, and the one in berth 2 had been running a low hum under his plate lock since 2:16. At 2:41, the hum stopped. In Vorthrak, voluntary silence at this stage of a compound sequence means the body has made a calculation. It knows what is coming. It is conserving. Sen opened the tin. She took out a second candy, the same way she had taken out the first, without looking down, without making anything of it. Put it on the bench beside her. Looked back at the far wall. Her heart rate was 51. Compound concentration was 1.1 milliliters per kilogram, which is past the point where every published human study had either been discontinued or had lost its subject to intervention. Her respiration was slow and even. I opened the anomaly notation file. I typed, "Neural cascade indicators show no expected response pattern at," and stopped. I have 29 years. I have the most comprehensive certified database in the Ketharin system. I have no category for a compound that arrives in a body and decides not to work. I deleted the line, not because it was wrong, because when I read it back, it sounded like the start of a report I did not yet know how to finish. Velcarath was there. I could see it in the blood work, 1.1 milliliters per kilogram, climbing as the chamber concentration held steady. The compound was doing what compounds do. It was entering her system and being taken up by her tissues and registering on every instrument I had. And then it was doing nothing. Not suppressed, not masked, flat. I said it aloud to the empty observation room, which I have never done before in 29 years of trials. The junior technician could not have heard it. No one could. I said it because I needed to hear whether it sounded true when spoken out loud. It sounded true. Sen ate the second candy at 2:44 and picked up the empty wrapper from the first one to fold it into a small square, which she set on the bench beside the tin. At 2:55, vial 3 released. Concentration, 1.4 milliliters per kilogram cumulative. In 6 years of Class 8 trials at this station, every cadet who reached 1.4 milliliters per kilogram without pharmacological support had done so because we intervened before they got there. The surviving Vorthrak in Berth 2 moved to the wall at 2:56. He did it with trained efficiency, 3 steps, back against the wall, right arm reaching for the counteragent kit mounted at the Berth station. He knew his threshold. He had calculated it before the trial, and he was acting on that calculation now precisely without hesitation. He pulled the kit open and deployed the first counteragent draw. The Vorthrak soldier in Berth 1 was already locked. The one in Berth 3 had been locked since 2:17 and had not moved since. Sen opened the tin and took out a third candy. She looked at the environmental display again, the same one she had checked when she asked about the scrubber. CO2 was down slightly now that the Vorthrak respiration had changed. She looked at it, nodded once like something had been confirmed, and put the candy on her tongue. Heart rate 49. Compound concentration 1.4 milliliters per kilogram and climbing. At 3:01, the junior technician on the instrument panel sent me a flag. I have received flags from technicians in trials before. A flag means something on the instruments has crossed a threshold that the automated system did not expect. I see them often. Vorthrak plate lock sometimes reads as a seismic event on the older sensors. Orvith cascade often spikes faster than the model anticipates. This flag was not from an automated threshold. It was a manual flag. She had written it herself. The note said, "Localized metabolic absorption signature, 0.3-second dip, synchronized with subject swallow." Repeating. 3 iterations confirmed. I read it twice. She had isolated something in the timestamp data, a pattern too small for the automated system to catch, too regular to be instrument noise. A 0.3-second dip in Sen's metabolic absorption signature, timed to the exact moment of swallowing, 3 times, all 3 lining up with the 3 candies she had taken from the tin. 3 iterations, precise, repeating, not instrument noise. Something in the act of swallowing, or in what she swallowed, or in the baseline chemistry of a human digestive system, or in whatever was inside that dented tin, was interacting with Velcarath in a way that no study in the 17-paper literature had ever recorded. Not a suppression, not a reversal. A 0.3-second synchronized dip that had occurred 3 times in sequence and had not triggered a single cascade marker. I looked at my notation file. I had 3 data points that should not exist. Flat cascade markers across 2 vials. Synchronization data precise enough to rule out noise. A compound concentration at 1.4 milliliters per kilogram in a subject whose body was treating it as background. I did not flag it upward. In 29 years, I have never held data without filing it. I have never made myself wait before opening a notation. I have never sat with something that needed documentation and decided to let it sit 1 more vial before I wrote it down. I told myself I needed more data. That was not entirely true. I also needed time to decide whether I was going to be the examiner who flagged an impossibility upward, who put her name on a file that said a 17-year-old cadet had walked through a 1.4 milliliter per kilogram exposure and asked about the ventilation, or the examiner who waited 1 more vial to make sure she was not wrong. I chose to wait. I am not certain I chose correctly. The junior technician sent me a second flag at 3:03. It said only, waiting for direction. I did not reply. Vial 4 was 12 minutes away. Vial 4 was 12 minutes away. I spent 11 of those minutes doing something I have not done in a trial since my third year. I went back through the sequence looking for the error I must have made. Not because I believed I had made one. Because the alternative was a 17-year-old cadet with 1.4 milliliters per kilogram of Velcarath in her bloodstream and a heart rate of 49 and no cascade response. And if that was real, then I needed to be certain I had checked everything else first. I checked the calibration log. Clean. The instrument panel had been certified 4 days earlier by a different technician, one I trusted. I checked the compound batch number against the station's intake record. Match. I checked Sen's sensor contact at the berth. Good contact, solid baseline, no gap in the signal since 2:03. Then I checked the synchronization data the junior technician had flagged. 3 dips, 0.3 seconds each, timed to the swallow. The first at 2:15, the second at 2:44, the third at 2:51. I pulled the raw waveform and looked at it without the smoothing filter. The dips were there. They were clean. Each one started at the moment the swallow registered on her esophageal sensor and ended 0.3 seconds after. And in each one, the metabolic absorption signature dropped to a level I would expect to see in a subject who had not been dosed at all. Not a suppression, not a mask, a door that opened for 0.3 seconds, 3 times, and let the compound through at a level of 0, and then closed again. I put the raw waveform file on my desk screen where I could see it, and I looked at the dented tin in the trial footage, and I thought about citrus candies and the 17 papers, and the 4 that contradicted the other 13. And then I stopped thinking about it because the timer said 3:13 and vial 4 was releasing in 1 minute. I picked up the notation file and typed the time stamp and the compound concentration and the cascade indicator status, flat, and the synchronization data, all 3 iterations, precise. I typed the junior technician's flag number and attached her waveform note to the record. Then I typed, anomaly class unknown, mechanism unknown, no intervention deployed at this time. I hit save. The junior technician's screen lit at 3:13, and I saw her reach for the manual hold switch on the vial 4 release. Her hand stopped an inch from it. She looked through the chamber glass at Sen. I said into the intercom, release on schedule. She pulled her hand back. Vial 4 released at 3:14. Total cumulative concentration in Sen Orvath's bloodstream, 1.7 milliliters per kilogram. The Vorthrak soldier in berth 1 had been locked for 60 minutes. He did not move. The one in berth 3 had been locked since 2:17. The one in berth 2 had deployed his counteragent at 2:56 and was sitting against the wall with his eyes open, plates resting. Both Orvath were still down in berths 4 and 5, slow respiratory cycles, deep in the compound's second phase. Sen picked up the 3rd candy wrapper from the bench and folded it into a square to match the first 2. She was not looking at the chamber door. She was not watching the environmental display. She had her 3 small paper squares lined up on the bench beside the tin, and she was straightening the edges of the 3rd one with the side of her thumb. Heart rate 48. I have 4,400 certified trial files. I know what a body looks like when it is working against a compound. I know the grip of the hands, the set of the jaw, the way breathing shallows out when the body is trying to hold something back. I know what it looks like when the body has lost that fight. I know what it looks like in the in-between. The long middle stretch where a subject is burning everything they have just to stay where they are. Sen looked like someone who had finished something small and was thinking about whether to start something else. At 3:19, she opened the tin. She looked inside for a moment, then she closed it. It was empty. She held the closed tin in her lap and looked at the far wall with the same expression she had worn since 1:51. The one I had decided, at 1:51, was within parameters. She said, "How long for the others?" Her voice was easy, no strain. She was asking the way you ask when a meeting is running long and you want to know if there is coffee coming. I said, approximately 40 minutes. She said, okay. I waited for her to say something else. She did not say anything else. She looked at the far wall and held the tin and waited. Her heart rate was 48. Compound concentration was 1.7 milliliters per kilogram. The cascade indicators had not moved once in 73 minutes of exposure. At 3:27, the junior technician sent me a 3rd flag. It said, 4th dip on the waveform, no candy administered, spontaneous, amplitude double the previous 3, duration 0.6 seconds, no intake event detected. I read it once. A 4th dip, no candy, Nothing she had swallowed, just the compound in her system and her body doing the same thing it had done 3 times at the moment of each swallow, except now without the swallow. Spontaneous. Double the amplitude. 0.6 seconds. I looked at Sen on the live feed. She was still looking at the far wall. Her left hand was resting on the tin. Her right hand had moved to the bench and was touching the edge of the 3 folded paper squares, not rearranging them, just resting there. Something had changed. She was not doing anything different. But the 0.6-second dip had happened without any intake event, which meant the mechanism I had been watching. Whatever the candy was doing, whatever the act of swallowing was triggering, was not the whole picture. The body had done it on its own. I pulled up the waveform and looked at the 4th dip beside the first 3. The shape was different. The first 3 were clean entry, flat floor, clean exit. The 4th had a slope on the leading edge, a longer floor, a stepped exit. Not a door opening and closing. More like a door opening, holding, and then stepping down in 2 stages before it closed. I had no paper for this, not 1 page in 17 studies. At 3:31, I wrote 4 lines in the notation file and flagged the record to senior review. 4 lines, not a finding, not a mechanism, just spontaneous metabolic dip event at 3:27, amplitude 2x prior, no intake event detected, flagged for senior review. I sent it before I could decide not to. The Vorthrak in berth 2 looked up at 3:39. His plates were settling, the slow, deliberate re-engagement that comes after counteragent deployment, the body recalibrating. He turned his head and looked at Sen. He held the look for 6 seconds. I do not speak Vorthrak resonance. I know the shapes of it, the frequency ranges that correspond to broad categories, distress, inquiry, recognition. What he was running in those 6 seconds was in a range I have logged maybe 40 times in trials, always directed at the monitoring team, always in the same situation. A subject who has seen something in another subject that the instruments did not predict. Sen did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the far wall. At 3:47, the Orvith in berth 4 began to come up. This is the slow part of an Orvith trial. The ascent from the second phase low is gradual and the body does not rush it. She had her eyes closed, one hand on the bench, breathing long. At 3:51, the second Orvith came up. They did not cluster again. They sat in their separate berths and let the compound clear. At 3:54, the Vorthrak soldier in berth 1 unlocked. The plate lock release on a Vorthrak is not subtle. When the compound clears the synaptic relay clusters and the body lets go, the plates flex all at once, a dry crack. The sound of armored tissue moving through a full range of motion after an hour of locked stillness. He was locked for 100 minutes. The sound when he let go was louder than the initial lock. Sen looked at him. She said, "Okay there." He did not answer. He did not have enough resonance capacity, yet to answer. He looked at her with the same regard the other one had used at 3:39 and said nothing. She nodded once, the way she had nodded at the CO2 reading, like something had been confirmed, and went back to looking at the far wall. At 4:09, I opened the chamber. Standard close-of trial protocol. I said the sequence over the intercom. The berth lights shifted to close-cycle amber. The Vorthrak began the plate mobility assessment. The Orvith checked each other's hands. Sen picked up her 3 paper squares and put them back in the tin. She put the tin in her left hand and stood up. She walked to the chamber door and stepped into the corridor without looking back at the berths. I was waiting in the corridor. She stopped when she saw me. Not startled, she had expected someone, just not this close. Her eyes were clear. No pupil response, no flush in the skin, no sign of the long, slow work of compound clearance that every other subject showed for 30 minutes after a Class 8 sequence. She looked at me the way someone looks when they know a question is coming, and they are not sure which question it will be. I said, "The tin." She looked down at it, then up at me. I said, "I need it." She held it for a moment. The seams were worn the way they get from being opened and closed by the same hands many times. The label was half peeled, the kind of half peel that happens slowly over months, not all at once. She had carried it into a Class 8 trial because it was familiar, because it was hers, because she had held it before in rooms where she needed to wait. She held it out to me. I took it. Inside, 6 paper squares folded small, 3 candy wrappers. The crease on each one was the same, pressed flat with the side of a thumb. No candies left. I said, "The compound in your blood work, your markers." She said, "I know." I said, "How?" She said, "I don't know." She said it plainly, not as a deflection, not as the answer a person gives when they know more than they are saying. She said it the way a person says something they have said before to themselves in the dark without getting any closer to an answer. She said, "It's always been like that, since I was small." I looked at her. I have been looking at trial data for 29 years, and I know how to read the gap between what a subject says and what their body has already told me. There was no gap. She was 17 years old, and she did not know why the compound had done nothing. And she had been not knowing it long enough that she had learned to hold the not knowing the same way she held the tin, familiar, in her left hand, something she carried into rooms where she needed to wait. I said, "You knew the dose." She said, "Yes." I said, "You walked in anyway." She looked at the tin in my hands. Then she said, "I was certified for Class 8. The certification doesn't say unless it might not work on you." She was right. The certification did not say that. I had certified her for Class 8, and she had passed every pre-trial indicator, and I had not known, and she had known, and she had walked in anyway because that was what the certification was for. I did not know what to say to that. She said, "Are we done?" I said, "No." She waited. I said, "I've flagged the data to senior review. There will be interviews, more testing if you agree to it. A new protocol, probably several. Your file is going to be read by people who are going to want to understand what happened in that chamber." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Okay." Not resigned, not eager. Just, "Okay." The same word she had said at 3:19 when I told her it would be 40 minutes. The word of someone who has agreed to wait before and knows how to do it. I walked her to the debrief room and handed her off to the medical team. She sat in the chair and put the tin on the table beside her and answered the intake questions without looking at it. I went back to the observation room. The junior technician was still at her station. She looked up when I came in. I set the tin on the desk between us. I said, "Your flag at 3:03, waiting for direction." She said, "Yes." I said that was the right call. She did not say anything. I looked at the notation file. 4 lines flagged to senior review. The waveform data. The synchronization timestamps. A compound concentration of 1.7 milliliters per kilogram and cascade markers that had never moved. I looked at the tin. It was old. The metal at the corners had gone soft from years of handling. The label remnants showed something, the edge of a word, maybe a brand, maybe a name, worn down to where it was more shape than letter. The hinges worked smoothly from use. I opened it. 6 paper squares, pressed flat, stacked in a small pile, each one the same fold, the same crease, the same careful flattening with the side of a thumb. I closed it and wrote the item number in the evidence log.